The first thing I noticed was the missing mailbox. The second thing I noticed was the HOA sign standing beside my driveway like someone had already decided my property belonged to them. I had driven down that road for more than 30 years, and I knew every detail of it. I knew the old oak tree near the entrance where my father used to park his truck before walking the rest of the way to the cabin. I knew the section of gravel that always collected rainwater after a storm. I knew the exact moment when the trees opened up and Silver Pine Lake appeared in the distance. To most people, it was just a private road leading to an old cabin. To me, it was the place where my family history was written. My father built that cabin in 1985 when the lake was still quiet and mostly untouched. Back then, there were no large homes surrounding the shoreline, no community entrance signs, no homeowners association meetings about access, rules, or control. There was only the lake, the forest, and a small cabin where my family could escape the noise of everyday life. My father was not someone who built things to impress people. He built things to last. Every board on the porch was measured carefully. Every repair around the dock was done properly. Every improvement had a reason behind it. When I was younger, I did not always understand why he spent so much time on small details. I wanted things finished faster. I wanted to use the cabin instead of watching him spend hours making sure everything was exactly right. He always told me the same thing. If something is worth keeping, it is worth taking care of. Years later, those words became more important than I ever expected. That morning, I thought I was going to have a normal weekend. I stopped for coffee, picked up a few supplies, and drove toward the cabin to repair some old boards on the porch before spending the afternoon by the lake. But when I turned onto the gravel road, something immediately felt wrong. The mailbox that had been there for years was gone. In its place was a large wooden post with a new sign attached to it. Silver Pines Lake Estates Community Access Area. I slowed the truck and stared at it. At first, I thought I had missed something. Maybe there had been a notice. Maybe someone had contacted me. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But there was nothing. No letter. No phone call. No conversation. Just a sign standing beside the road that led directly to my property. I stepped out of the truck and walked closer. That was when I noticed the white SUV parked near the trees. The driver's door opened, and Victoria Whitmore stepped out. Victoria was the president of Silver Pines Lake Estates Homeowners Association. I had seen her at community meetings before. She was always prepared, always organized, always confident that she understood every situation before anyone else in the room. She carried a tablet in one hand and a leather folder in the other. "Ethan Caldwell," she said with a polite smile. "I was wondering when you would notice the changes." I looked at the sign, then back at her. "What changes?" Victoria walked closer and pointed toward the road. "Silver Pines has been reviewing access around the lake. We are making improvements to create better organization for everyone." I looked at the sign again. "Everyone?" I asked. "Including me?" She smiled. "Of course. The community benefits when everyone follows the same system." I looked down the road toward my cabin. "What system are you talking about?" Victoria opened the folder and removed several pages. "The HOA has been managing this area for years. With more residents using the lake, we need clearer boundaries and better control." The word control stood out immediately. "Do those documents show that the HOA owns this road?" I asked. For a brief moment, Victoria stopped. It was quick, almost impossible to notice. But I noticed. "The HOA has maintained this area for a long time," she replied. I nodded slowly. Maintaining something is not the same as owning it. Behind her, two board members stood near the SUV. One of them was Richard Bell, a neighbor I had known for years. He looked uncomfortable, not angry, not defensive, just uncertain. Victoria folded her arms. "Ethan, you need to understand that Silver Pines has grown. More families live here now. More people use these areas." I looked toward the lake. She was right about one thing. The area had changed. New homes had been built. More people had moved in. Growth was normal. But growth did not erase property boundaries. It did not rewrite old documents. And it did not transfer ownership. "I understand the community has changed," I said. "But that does not change who owns the land." Victoria gave a small smile. "I think you are looking at this too narrowly." That sentence told me exactly how she saw the situation. She believed this was a disagreement between two opinions. But property was not decided by confidence. It was not decided by popularity. It was decided by what the official records said. I could have argued right there. I could have demanded that the sign be removed. But my father taught me something years ago. When someone is completely certain they are right, the smartest thing to do is understand why they believe it. So I took a sip of coffee and looked back at Victoria. Before you start changing things around my property, I said, you should probably check who actually has the right to make those decisions. For the first time that morning, Victoria did not immediately respond. She looked at me for a moment, then returned to her SUV. We will discuss this later, she said. She drove away with the board members following behind her. I stayed there beside the new sign for several minutes. The lake was calm. The trees moved gently in the wind. Everything looked exactly the same except for that one thing standing beside my road. Someone had made a major decision about my property without asking the simplest question first. Who actually had the right to control this? And I had a feeling that answer was about to reveal a much bigger mistake than anyone at Silver Pines expected. For the next several days, the new HOA sign remained beside my driveway exactly where Victoria Whitmore had placed it. Every morning when I drove toward the cabin, I saw the same words standing there as if they had always belonged on that piece of land. Silver Pines Lake Estates Community Access Area. It was only a sign, a few pieces of wood and some painted letters. But what it represented was much bigger. It was a statement. Someone had decided they had authority over a place my family had cared for long before Silver Pines Lake Estates existed. What bothered me most was not the sign itself. It was how quickly everyone accepted it. Nobody stopped to ask who approved it. Nobody asked to see the documents behind it. Nobody questioned whether the HOA actually had the right to make decisions about that road. The sign looked official, and for many people, that was enough. A few days after the sign appeared, I received an invitation from Silver Pines Lake Estates. The message was polite. It said the HOA board wanted to discuss recent access changes and answer questions from nearby property owners. I read it carefully and set it down on the kitchen table. I already understood what Victoria was trying to do. She wanted to explain the situation before anyone started looking for answers on their own. But I also knew something else. If someone truly believed they had the right to control a property, the easiest thing in the world should be showing the proof. So I decided to attend the meeting. Not because I wanted an argument. Not because I wanted to challenge Victoria in front of the entire neighborhood. I simply wanted to hear her explanation. The Silver Pines clubhouse was crowded when I arrived. Residents filled the chairs. Some were longtime homeowners who had lived near the lake for decades. Others were newer residents who had moved into the larger houses built around the shoreline. I recognized several faces from previous community meetings. They looked curious. They knew something had changed. They just did not know exactly what. Victoria stood at the front of the room with her tablet connected to a large screen. She looked completely comfortable. She had prepared everything carefully. "Thank you everyone for coming," she began. "I know there have been some questions regarding recent access updates." I noticed the wording immediately. Questions. Not a dispute. Not a conflict. Questions. She displayed pictures of the road, the shoreline, and different areas around the neighborhood. She talked about safety. She talked about organization. She talked about creating a better experience for everyone living around the lake. If someone only heard her presentation, it sounded reasonable. The HOA wanted planning. The HOA wanted consistency. The HOA wanted to make sure residents could enjoy the area. But there was one thing missing. She never explained why the HOA had the legal right to make those decisions. A man sitting near the front raised his hand. "Victoria, I have a question. Does the HOA actually own the road near Ethan Caldwell's property?" The room became quiet. Victoria smiled politely. "The HOA has maintained that area for years. We have invested in improvements that benefit the neighborhood." The man nodded. "I understand that. But I am asking if the HOA owns it." For a moment, Victoria looked down at her tablet. It was brief, almost unnoticeable, but it was the same hesitation I had seen beside my driveway. "The community has used that access for a long time," she said. Again, she answered a different question. She talked about history. She talked about use. She talked about what people wanted. But ownership was something else entirely. I watched several residents begin to notice the difference. They were not against Victoria. They were simply realizing that the answer they expected was not being given. After the meeting ended, I walked outside and found Richard Bell standing near the parking lot. He looked like he had been waiting for me. "Ethan," he said, "I hope you understand nobody is trying to make this difficult." I looked at him. Then why was nobody asked before the sign was installed? Richard looked back toward the clubhouse. "I thought Victoria had everything handled." That answer explained more than he probably realized. Richard was not the person who created the situation. He was someone who trusted the person who claimed to have the solution. "Did you ever see documents showing the HOA on the road?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. I saw improvement plans, community proposals, budget discussions. I assumed the legal side had already been taken care of." I nodded slowly. That was the part many people missed. Plans showed what someone wanted to build. Budgets showed what someone wanted to spend. Community approval showed what people supported. But none of those things automatically proved ownership. On the drive back to the cabin, I kept thinking about that conversation. The HOA did not need everyone to know every detail. They only needed everyone to believe the same version of the story. That evening, I opened the old filing cabinet in my office. It was the same cabinet my father used to store property papers, maps, and receipts. Some folders had not been touched in years. I pulled out the first one and placed it on the kitchen table. I was not looking for a fight with Victoria. I was not trying to embarrass anyone. I simply wanted to know what the records actually said. Because Victoria had spent a lot of time explaining why she believed she was right. But she had never shown the one thing that mattered most. Proof. The old filing cabinet had been sitting in the corner of my office for years. It was one of those things I walked past every day without really noticing anymore. But my father was never someone who threw away important details. He believed that anything connected to the cabin was worth preserving. He kept receipts from repairs. He kept maps from property surveys. He kept handwritten notes about improvements he made over the years. When I was younger, I used to laugh and tell him he saved too much paperwork. He would just smile and say, "You never know when a small detail will become the thing that matters most." Sitting at the kitchen table that night, I finally understood exactly what he meant. I placed the folders in front of me and started reviewing them one by one. I was not looking for a way to embarrass Victoria Whitmore. I was not trying to prove someone wrong. I simply wanted to know if my memory matched the official information. The first folder contained the original purchase documents from 1985. Inside was the survey map from when my father bought the property. The paper was older now. The edges were worn, but the information was still clear. The cabin was marked. The shoreline was marked. The access road was marked. I followed the boundary lines slowly with my finger. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered. The road beside my driveway was connected to my property. The shoreline near the cabin was part of the original parcel. But I wanted more than my own memory. I wanted confirmation from someone whose job was to know these things. I did not want to make the same mistake Victoria had made. I did not want to assume. The next morning, I drove into town and visited the county records office. It was a simple building. Nothing impressive. No large entrance. No special decorations. Just shelves of documents, computers, and people who spent their days protecting information that most property owners only searched for when something went wrong. Sarah Mitchell was working behind the front counter when I walked in. She had helped me with paperwork years earlier and recognized me immediately. "Ethan Caldwell," she said. "It has been a while." I placed the folder on the counter. "I need to verify some property information." Sarah looked through the documents while I explained what happened. I told her about the HOA sign. I told her about Victoria saying the area was under community control. I did not tell her what I believed the answer would be. I wanted the records to speak first. She entered the information into the system and reviewed several files. After a few minutes, she leaned closer to the screen. "That is interesting," she said. I looked at her. "What did you find?" She pointed toward the property map. "This access road is still connected to your parcel." I waited for her to continue. "There is no recorded transfer showing that Silver Pines Lake Estates owns this road." I looked at the screen quietly. There was something powerful about seeing the information officially confirmed. Not because I wanted to win against Victoria, because it meant this was not about two different opinions. It was about what the documents actually showed. Sarah continued reviewing the records. "Let me check the shoreline information too." She opened older files and compared them with newer maps. The room became quiet while she searched. After several minutes, she stopped. "Ethan, you should see this." She turned the monitor toward me. The shoreline connected to my property had never been transferred either. No sale. No agreement. No recorded change in ownership. I looked at the information carefully. Suddenly, several things I had noticed over the years started making more sense. The additional dock sections. The boat spaces near the water. The signs carrying the Silver Pines name. These were not random improvements. They were part of a larger system built around something nobody had verified. The HOA had not simply maintained a shared area. They had expanded their control based on a belief that was never confirmed. I thought back to Victoria standing beside my driveway. She had spoken with complete confidence. She had acted as if the decision was already final. But confidence could not replace documentation. Before I left, Sarah printed copies of the records for me. "Keep these organized," she said. "Property issues usually come down to details." I thanked her and carefully placed everything into my folder. On the drive back to Silver Pine Lake, I passed the entrance to the HOA neighborhood. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Beautiful homes, clean landscaping, boats along the shoreline, a community that appeared completely organized. But now I saw something different. Behind all of it was a question nobody seemed to have asked. How much of Silver Pines had been built around an assumption? When I returned to the cabin, I placed the county records beside my father's original survey. 2 sets of documents. 2 different moments in time. One showed where everything began. The other showed what had changed since then. And between those pages was the answer Victoria Whitmore never looked for. She had been making decisions about property she never actually had the right to control. The county records answered the question I had been trying to confirm, but they also made me think about something much deeper. Sitting at the kitchen table with my father's old survey beside the official documents from the county office, I realized this was never just about a sign beside my driveway. It was never just about a road. It was never just about access to a shoreline. It was about a place that carried decades of memories. To someone who had never stepped onto the property before, my cabin probably looked like a valuable piece of land on a beautiful lake, a private road, a quiet shoreline, a location that became more desirable as the area around it developed. But I did not see it that way. I saw the place where my father taught me lessons I still carried today. My father built the cabin in 1985 when Silver Pine Lake was still a completely different world. Back then, the shoreline was mostly trees. The roads were simple gravel paths. The few people who lived nearby knew each other. Nobody was talking about community access plans or neighborhood control. People came to the lake because they wanted peace. They wanted a place where they could slow down and enjoy the simple things. My father was not someone who cared about appearances. He did not build the cabin to impress visitors or create something luxurious. He built it because he wanted a place our family could return to year after year. He spent weekends working on it after long weeks at his regular job. He measured every board carefully. He repaired small problems before they became bigger ones. He believed doing something correctly mattered more than doing it quickly. When I was younger, I did not always understand that patience. I wanted things finished faster. I wanted to use the cabin instead of watching him spend hours making small improvements that most people would never notice. I remember one afternoon when we were repairing the old dock. I asked him why he was measuring every board so carefully when nobody would know the difference. He looked at me and smiled. "You will know the difference," he said, "because you will know it was done right." At the time, I thought he was only talking about the dock. Years later, I realized he was talking about everything. The cabin became even more important after my father passed away. It became the one place where I still felt connected to him. I would arrive early in the morning, make coffee, and sit on the porch while the lake was still quiet. I kept the old wooden chair he used to sit in near the water. The paint had faded. The wood had aged, but I never replaced it. It was not valuable because of what it cost. It was valuable because of who had used it. That was why Victoria Whitmore's decision bothered me. It was not because she wanted people to enjoy the lake. I understood that. A lake is meant to be enjoyed. The problem was the way she approached it. She looked at the open areas around the water and immediately saw opportunities for management. She saw places where the HOA could add improvements. She saw areas where the community could expand access. But she never stopped to ask whether she had permission. After reviewing the documents, I walked along the shoreline again. This time, I looked at everything differently. I noticed the newer dock sections, the boat spaces, the signs carrying the Silver Pines name. These were not random changes. They represented years of decisions made by people who believed they had authority. The sign beside my driveway was only the first thing I noticed. The bigger issue was everything that had been built around that belief. That evening, my phone rang. It was Victoria. Her voice sounded calmer than before. "Ethan," she said, "I think we should talk again. There may have been some misunderstandings." I looked out the window toward the lake. The same lake my father looked at decades earlier. The same water I still washed whenever I needed a quiet moment. I agree, I said. We should talk. Because sometimes the best way to understand why someone made a decision is to let them explain it in their own words. And I wanted to hear exactly how Victoria Whitmore believed she gained control over something she never actually owned. Victoria Whitmore arrived at the cabin 2 days after our phone conversation. She arrived exactly at 10 in the morning, just as she said she would. That did not surprise me. Victoria was someone who believed preparation created certainty. She liked schedules. She liked organized meetings. She liked walking into a conversation with every document arranged and every possible response already considered. Her white SUV stopped near the gravel driveway, and she stepped out holding the same leather folder I had seen beside the HOA sign. Richard Bell came with her, along with Caroline Pierce, another member of the HOA board. They walked toward the porch together while I waited outside. For a moment, nobody said anything. The lake behind them was calm. The trees moved gently in the breeze. It was almost strange how peaceful everything looked compared to the disagreement happening in front of me. Victoria looked around the property before speaking. Her eyes moved from the cabin to the dock, then toward the shoreline. I noticed something about the way she looked at the area. She was not seeing the memories connected to it. She was seeing a place that needed to be organized. "Ethan," she said, "thank you for agreeing to meet. I think we can clear up some misunderstandings." I nodded. "I am listening." She opened the folder and removed several pages. Silver Pines Lake Estates has invested significant time and resources into improving this area. Residents have supported these projects, and they have become important parts of the community. I looked at the papers in her hand. "What exactly are you saying the HOA controls?" Victoria paused briefly. "The access road, the waterfront areas, the boat spaces." This time, she did not say management. She said control. I looked at her carefully. "Do you have any recorded documents showing that the HOA owns those areas?" The question changed the atmosphere immediately. Nobody became upset. Nobody argued. But everyone noticed the silence that followed. Victoria looked down at the folder. "The HOA has maintained those areas for years." I nodded. "Maintenance is not ownership." Richard looked toward the lake. Caroline looked through her notes. They both understood the difference. Victoria closed the folder. "Ethan, I think you are focusing too much on technical details." I looked back toward the old dock my father built. Technical details are usually what decide property issues. She took a breath. "The community has invested time and money into these improvements. People rely on them. I believe that. I had no reason to doubt that residents enjoyed the lake or appreciated the work done around the neighborhood. But using something and owning something were not the same." "Victoria," I said, "I am not trying to stop people from enjoying the lake. That was never the problem. The problem is that decisions were made about my property without anyone asking." She looked toward the water. "You have to understand that Silver Pines is different now. It has grown." I nodded. "I understand that. But growth does not change property records." For the first time, Victoria did not have an immediate response. The confidence she had shown beside the sign was not as strong. "I think we have different views of what happened here," she said. "Maybe," I replied. "That is why the documents matter." The meeting ended shortly after that. Victoria gathered her papers and walked back toward her SUV. Richard stayed behind for a moment. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I honestly did not know the situation was this complicated." I looked at him. Most people did not. After they left, I went back inside the cabin and called Daniel Harper. I explained the conversation exactly as it happened. I did not add emotion. I did not exaggerate. I simply repeated the facts. The sign, the shoreline, the boat spaces, the statements Victoria made. Daniel listened carefully. When I finished, he asked one question. "Did she show you any ownership documents?" "No," I answered. There was a short pause. "Then do not argue with assumptions," Daniel said. "Let the paperwork speak." That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the county records spread out in front of me. The more I reviewed them, the clearer the situation became. Victoria believed she had authority because the HOA had acted like it had authority for years. Residents believed it because they trusted the HOA. The entire system depended on one thing. Nobody had stopped to verify the foundation underneath it. But now the question had finally been asked. And once the records were examined, the answer could not be ignored. Daniel Harper arrived at the cabin the following morning with a folder that was much thicker than the one he had brought before. I noticed that immediately. Daniel was not someone who carried extra paperwork without a reason. He placed the folder on the kitchen table, looked toward the lake for a moment, and then sat down across from me. "Ethan," he said, "I spent more time reviewing the history of this property last night. There is something important you need to see." He opened the folder and pulled out several maps, photographs, and copies of older documents. The first document was the original survey from when my father purchased the land. The second was a newer development map showing how Silver Pines Lake Estates expanded over the years. Daniel placed them side by side. "Look here," he said. "The neighborhood grew around your property, but your boundaries never changed." I followed the lines carefully. The cabin, the shoreline, the access road. Everything remained exactly where it had always been. "So the community grew around an assumption," I said. Daniel nodded. "That is what the documents suggest." He moved another set of papers across the table. These showed the different changes made near the shoreline over time. Additional dock sections, boat spaces, storage areas, community signs. They did not just allow people to use the area, Daniel explained. They created a system around it. I looked at the photographs quietly. For years, I had watched those changes happen. I noticed more activity near the water. I noticed more people spending time around the shoreline. But I never realized that all of those decisions were connected to the same misunderstanding. Nobody had stopped to confirm whether Silver Pines actually had the authority to make those decisions. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "The interesting part is that this does not appear to be one single mistake." He tapped the documents gently. "It looks like a series of assumptions built on top of each other." He explained how situations like this usually develop. Someone believes they have authority. Other people trust that person. Plans are created. Money is spent. Improvements are made. Eventually, everyone starts treating the original belief as if it were an established fact. But nobody goes back and checks where that belief came from. I looked out the window toward the driveway where the HOA sign was still standing. A few weeks earlier, Victoria looked at that sign like it represented control. Now I saw it differently. It was not a symbol of authority. It was a symbol of how easily confidence could replace verification. "What happens next?" I asked. Daniel organized the documents into separate sections. "We stay focused on the information. The strongest position is not proving Victoria wrong. The strongest position is showing what the documents say." I understood exactly what he meant. This was never about humiliating anyone. It was about correcting something that should have been handled properly from the beginning. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the shoreline. The lake was calm, and a few residents were out on the water. I watched them for a while. That was the part one kept thinking about. Most of those people were not trying to take anything from me. They were families enjoying a place they believed they had permission to use. They trusted the HOA because that was what homeowners usually did. The problem was not the residents. The problem was that nobody verified the details before expanding the use of the property. That evening, Daniel sent me a draft letter. I read every sentence carefully. It was professional and straightforward. It explained the property boundaries. It referenced the county documents. It requested that the HOA review its use of the areas connected to my property. There was no anger in the letter, no accusations, no attempt to create unnecessary conflict, just information. Before signing it, I looked around the cabin. The old wooden table, the pictures of my father, the walls he built with his own hands. I thought about how he handled problems. He never rushed. He never relied on assumptions. He checked the details first. That lesson stayed with me all these years. I signed the letter and handed it back to Daniel. Then I looked toward the driveway one more time. Victoria had spent years believing that control came from position, influence, and community approval. But there was one thing she had overlooked. Before anyone can make decisions about a property, they need the right to do so. And soon, everyone at Silver Pines would have to answer the same question I had been asking from the beginning. Who actually has the right to decide what happens on this land? The letter reached Silver Pines Lake Estates on a Tuesday morning. Daniel Harper made sure it was delivered exactly the way we planned. No accusations. No emotional language. No attempt to turn the situation into a personal conflict. Just the information that mattered. The letter explained the property boundaries, referenced the county documents, and requested that the HOA review its use of the driveway access, shoreline areas, and boat spaces connected to my property. It was not written to start a fight. It was written to create a clear record. After Daniel confirmed it had been received, I returned to the cabin and waited. Waiting was the hardest part. Not because I doubted the documents. I knew what the records showed. The difficult part was watching people react when something they had believed for years suddenly had to be questioned. For several days, nothing changed on the surface. The HOA sign remained beside my driveway. Residents continued using the lake areas. Boats remained near the shoreline. If someone drove through Silver Pines, they would have thought everything was completely normal. But inside the community, questions were beginning to spread. The first person who came to the cabin was Richard Bell. He arrived one afternoon in his pickup truck and parked near the driveway. When he walked toward the porch, I immediately noticed that he looked different from the man who had stood beside Victoria when the sign was installed. Before, he looked like someone supporting a decision. Now, he looked like someone trying to understand one. "Ethan," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" I invited him to sit down. We looked out at the lake for a while before he finally spoke. I did not know about those records. I looked at him. "What did you think existed?" Richard looked down for a moment. "I thought the HOA had everything approved." That answer explained a lot. Richard was not the person who created the problem. He was someone who trusted the person who claimed to have the answers. "Did Victoria ever show the board any ownership documents?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. She showed us improvement plans, community proposals, budget requests. She told us the HOA had authority." I nodded. That was the difference. Plans showed what someone wanted to build. Budgets showed what someone wanted to spend. Community approval showed what people supported. But none of those things proved ownership. Richard looked toward the water. "So the boat spaces might not belong to the HOA?" he asked. "The documents show those areas need to be reviewed based on actual property rights," I said. "The important thing is that nobody should have assumed ownership." He stayed quiet for a moment. Then he slowly nodded. After Richard left, I walked down to the shoreline. I looked at the docks and the boats tied nearby. I thought about how easily something could appear official. The signs, the meetings, the improvements, the organized way everything had been presented. Most people do not question something that looks like it has already been approved. But appearance is not the same as proof. That evening, Daniel called me. "We received a response from the HOA attorney," he said. I sat down at the kitchen table. "What did they say?" Daniel explained that the HOA was reviewing its position. The wording had changed. They were no longer saying the HOA had complete control over the areas. Instead, they said they had acted based on their understanding of the situation. That difference mattered. A few weeks earlier, Victoria spoke as if there was no question. Now the language was much more careful. "Are they still claiming ownership?" I asked. Daniel paused. "Not directly." I looked out toward the driveway. That answer told me everything I needed to know. The confidence was fading because the documents were stronger than the assumptions. The next day, I drove past the Silver Pines clubhouse and saw a new announcement posted near the entrance. Community meeting regarding property access and waterfront use. Victoria was calling another meeting. I knew why. She wanted one more opportunity to explain the situation before residents reached their own conclusions. She wanted to guide the conversation the same way she had from the beginning. But this time was different. Residents were not only hearing her explanation. They had seen the documents. They had started asking questions. And once people begin looking closely at the details, it becomes much harder to maintain a story that does not match the facts. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening. I knew Victoria would be there. I knew the residents would be there. And this time, the most important voice in the room would not belong to the person standing at the front. It would belong to the information everyone could finally see for themselves. The Friday evening meeting at Silver Pines Lake Estates felt different before it even started. The first time I walked into that clubhouse, people arrived because Victoria Whitmore had called a meeting and explained what the HOA planned to do. They trusted that everything had already been reviewed. They believed the decisions had been made carefully. This time, people walked in carrying copies of documents. They were not there just to listen. They were there because they wanted answers. Some residents stood near the entrance discussing the driveway sign, the shoreline, and the boat spaces. Others looked through the county documents they had received. Nobody was angry. Nobody was trying to create a confrontation. They were simply trying to understand how something that appeared official could have been built around information that was never fully verified. When I entered the room, Victoria was already standing at the front. She had her tablet. She had her folder. She had the same professional appearance she always carried. But there was one noticeable difference. She no longer looked like someone announcing a decision. She looked like someone preparing to explain one. Richard Bell and Caroline Pierce were sitting near the side of the room. Neither of them looked eager to speak. When the meeting began, Victoria stepped forward. "Thank you everyone for coming," she said. "I know there have been many questions regarding recent discussions about property access and waterfront use." I noticed the change immediately. Questions. Not confusion. Not improvements. Questions. The entire situation had shifted. Victoria continued explaining the history of Silver Pines Lake Estates. She talked about how residents had used the area for years. She talked about the maintenance work the HOA had organized. She talked about the improvements that had become part of the community experience. Everything she said contained some truth. Residents had enjoyed the lake. The HOA had spent time maintaining certain areas. People appreciated having access to the water. But there was still one question nobody had answered. Did the HOA actually have the right to control those areas? A man near the front raised his hand. "Victoria, I have a question. Before the sign was installed, did anyone verify that the HOA actually owned the road and shoreline areas?" The room became quiet. Victoria looked down at her notes for a moment. "The HOA has managed those areas for many years," she replied. The man nodded. "I understand that. But I am asking if ownership was ever verified." Several people looked toward Victoria. This was the question that started everything. But this time, everyone was listening carefully. Victoria took a slow breath. "We believed we had the proper authority based on the history of use and the improvements made over time." That answer was different. Earlier, she spoke as if the matter was already settled. Now she was explaining what she believed. Richard Bell slowly stood from his seat. "Victoria," he said, "I have a question too." The room became even quieter. "When we approved the improvement plans, did the board ever review actual ownership documents?" Victoria looked toward him. For the first time, the question was coming from someone who had supported her decisions. She paused. "We reviewed the information available to us at the time." Richard nodded slowly. "But did we review ownership records?" Nobody spoke. The silence answered the question before anyone did. Daniel Harper stood from his seat near the back of the room. He introduced himself and explained that he was representing me regarding the property information. His approach was exactly the same as always. Calm, professional, focused on the documents instead of emotions. "This discussion is not about whether residents enjoyed these areas," Daniel said. "The question is whether the HOA had the legal authority to make decisions about property that was never transferred to the association." He placed copies of the county records and surveys on a table near the front. Residents slowly moved closer to review them. I watched their reactions carefully. Nobody celebrated. Nobody tried to embarrass Victoria. They were simply surprised. They had believed someone had already checked everything before moving forward. One resident picked up the survey and studied it carefully. "So this road was never owned by the HOA?" he asked. Daniel explained the information clearly. Another resident looked at the shoreline records. "And these boat spaces were created without a recorded transfer." Daniel nodded. "That is why the arrangements need to be reviewed based on actual property rights." The room became quieter as people connected the details. The sign, the driveway, the docks, the community plans. Everything had grown from one assumption that nobody had stopped to verify. Victoria sat quietly for several minutes. For the first time since I met her, she did not have an immediate response for every question. The meeting continued for almost an hour. Residents asked what would happen next. They asked why the records had not been reviewed earlier. They asked how the situation would be corrected. Those were reasonable questions, and nobody in the room had an easy answer. After the meeting ended, several neighbors came over to speak with me. One older resident shook my hand. "I honestly thought everything had already been approved properly," he said. I nodded. Most people did. That was the truth. The residents were not the problem. They trusted the information they were given. The problem was that nobody checked the foundation before building decisions on top of it. Over the next several days, changes started happening. The HOA sign beside my driveway was removed. The access issue was reviewed. The waterfront arrangements were reconsidered. Residents received updates about the next steps. The boat spaces connected to those areas would need to be handled through proper agreements instead of assumptions. Slowly, everything began moving back toward reality. Not because someone won a personal battle. Not because someone forced anyone to admit defeat. Because the information finally matched the decisions being made. One evening, I sat on the porch of my cabin and watched the sunset over Silver Pine Lake. The driveway was open again. The water was calm. The place felt like it belonged to the memories I had always known. But I also knew there was still one final conversation left. Victoria had spent years believing authority came from her position and the trust people placed in her. Now she had to face something much simpler. A position can create responsibility. It cannot create ownership. The weeks after the community meeting were much quieter than the weeks before it. The HOA sign beside my driveway was gone. The road looked the way it had for decades, just a simple gravel path surrounded by trees leading toward the cabin. Every morning when I drove down that road, I noticed the same things I had noticed my entire life. The old oak tree near the entrance. The curve where my father used to slow the truck before reaching the cabin. The first glimpse of Silver Pine Lake between the branches. But now, there was something different. The road was no longer a place where people questioned who had control. It had become a reminder of how quickly assumptions could turn into decisions when nobody stopped to verify the details. Daniel Harper continued working with the HOA to finalize the remaining issues. The biggest question had already been answered, but there were still details that needed to be corrected. The waterfront arrangements, the boat spaces, the future use of certain areas near the shoreline. Those conversations became much easier once everyone accepted the same information. A few days later, Daniel asked me to meet him at his office. When I arrived, he had a folder waiting on his desk. "The HOA is ready to finalize the agreement," he said. I opened the documents and started reading. The difference from the first conversations was obvious. There were no claims that the HOA controlled everything. No statements that decisions had already been made. The language was focused on moving forward based on the actual property information. I looked at Daniel. "So they understand now?" He nodded. "They do." That answer meant more to me than I expected. Not because I wanted Victoria to lose. Not because I wanted anyone embarrassed. I never wanted a fight. I wanted the situation handled correctly. Later that week, I met with Victoria Whitmore and the HOA board one final time. This meeting was completely different from our first conversation beside the driveway. There was no presentation, no tablet showing community plans, no explanation about why the HOA believed it was right. There were only documents on the table and people discussing what needed to happen next. Victoria looked different. She was still professional. She was still composed. But the certainty she carried before was gone. "Ethan," she said, looking back, "we should have verified everything before making those decisions." It was the first time she openly acknowledged that the mistake happened before the sign was ever installed. I appreciated that. Everyone makes mistakes. The important part is what someone does after discovering one. We reviewed the remaining details carefully. The road access, the shoreline use, the boat spaces, the community improvements. The solutions were much simpler once everyone accepted the same reality. The HOA could manage the areas where it actually had authority. It could organize events. It could create rules for its own property. But it could not create ownership through years of use, community approval, or good intentions. Over the following weeks, residents received updated information. The HOA reviewed previous decisions. New arrangements were created based on actual property rights instead of assumptions. The people living at Silver Pines were not treated as enemies. They were simply given the information they should have had from the beginning. One evening, I sat on the old dock with a cup of coffee and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. The lake was calm. The cabin was quiet. For the first time in months, everything felt normal again. I looked toward the cabin and thought about everything that had happened. The sign, the meetings, the documents, the questions nobody asked until it became impossible to ignore them. Then I looked at the old wooden chair sitting on the porch. The same chair my father used when he watched the lake in the mornings. The paint was faded. The wood was worn, but it was still there, just like the lessons he left behind. My father never tried to win arguments by being the loudest person in the room. He believed in patience. He believed in careful work. He believed that the details mattered. Years later, those simple habits protected the place he built. The answer had never been hidden. It was sitting in old surveys. It was stored in county files. It was written down long before anyone thought there would be a disagreement. The mistake was not that the information did not exist. The mistake was that nobody looked for it. Victoria believed authority came from her position. She believed a community decision could create a right that was never transferred. She believed enough people accepting something could make it official. But property does not work that way. A position can create responsibility. It cannot create ownership. A group decision can create plans. It cannot create ownership. Confidence can create certainty. It cannot create ownership. The documents always had the final answer. The cabin was still standing. The road was open. The lake was peaceful again. And as I sat there watching the sunset over Silver Pine Lake, I thought about the day Victoria placed that sign beside my driveway. She believed she was creating a boundary. She believed she was establishing control. But in the end, that sign did something completely different. It revealed the question everyone should have asked before making any decision. Who actually had the right to decide what happened on this land? The answer was there all along. Not in a meeting, not in a title, not in the confidence of the person making the decision. It was in the quiet documents that had been sitting in my father's filing cabinet for decades, waiting for the moment when someone finally needed the truth.